This is the Sony A6000, and I've just bought the cheapest one on eBay. Here it is. This cost me $220 body only. It didn't come with the original battery, it came with a third-party one, which isn't ideal, but that's alright, it still works. It's got just under 19,000 shutter actuations, and I did have to give it a bit of a deep clean because there was quite a bit of dust around the ports, the buttons, and the viewfinder. Now, similar A6000s can go anywhere from $300 to $400, so this was way below market value. Now, the condition, in all honesty, was not bad at all, aside from a few scuffs on the left side of the screen, which you can't really see if you turn the screen on. The camera is actually in quite good condition. From what I could find out from the seller, it's only been used for photos, for taking photos in a studio environment. It hasn't been outside, it hasn't been in the rain, it hasn't been anywhere else except a controlled studio environment. Everything works exactly as it should. The sensor was cleaned and it's absolutely spotless. The buttons are all quite clicky for a camera of this age. The scroll wheel still works. The record button is a little bit soft, so it's hard to know whether you've actually pressed it before confirming on screen. Now, the A6000 came out in 2014, so you can't really expect the highest end specs. I mean, you do get 24 megapixel images and 11 FPS burst, which in all honesty is quite in line with most of their most recent cameras. 24 megapixels and 10-11 burst FPS are more or less congruent with Sony's most recent camera releases. But it's not photo, it's actually video, where you can really start to see the Sony A6000's age. Maximum shooting is at 60 FPS at 1080p, but I've just thrown a bunch of numbers at you. Let's see how well it performs in real life. So I've got here the Sony A6000, and to try and see if it's worth it, I'm going to be comparing it to images I've taken on the iPhone 13 Pro Max. This is also a few years old at this stage, so I think this will be quite a good comparison. Now, I'm pairing the Sony A6000 with the 16 to 70mm f4 Zeiss lens. So in my eyes, it seems to be the differentiating factor seems to be the iPhone has much better dynamic range, which is what we expected. We expected that to be the case. In terms of a purely cinematic image, I think the Sony A6000 takes it by miles, with the sensor being much larger than the smartphone size camera sensor on the iPhone. You end up producing a much more cinematic image. Bokeh in the background is much nicer and blurrier. Sony takes the depth of field by miles, and I definitely prefer the bokeh and overall cinematic look of the images from the A6000. Technically, now these A6000 images are technically more detailed with 24 megapixel as compared to 12 megapixel on the iPhone. The A6000 does have technically more detail as well, and so that's something to consider. In editing, you do have more to work with. People mention a lot about cropping. I don't think there'll be any discernible differences between the two, but the A6000 does have more megapixels to work with in editing, in post-processing. Now, an important point to consider, for things like social media, the iPhone definitely is miles ahead, simply because people are more accustomed to the iPhone color science, dynamic range, and overall contrast in social media feeds. So in terms of ease of use for social media, the iPhone takes it by miles. Now, in low light is where the Sony A6000 really struggles quite a bit. Even in semi-good lighting, it crushes the shadows and overall produces much darker images. If I pump up the ISO, then it introduces a lot of noise into the images as well. Now, one of the main differences we're dealing with here is that the Sony A6000 pushes out a much more raw image, whereas the iPhone can do much more software trickery in the background and software engineering to make an image look more appealing. Now, in a controlled environment, video is where I expect the Sony A6000 to really shine. Phone video is still nowhere near as capable as producing a video image from a dedicated camera. With the iPhone, again, you're dealing with a much smaller smartphone-sized camera sensor, whereas the Sony A6000 has an APS-C size sensor, so it's capturing much more light. Depth of field is again much better, and even with software iterations of cinematic mode the iPhone has, it's nowhere near as good at detecting the edges of an image and producing a really nice fall off between images that are close to the camera and images that are further back. Smartphone sized camera sensors have to rely so heavily on the software side of things that the bokeh they produce and the edge detection is just nowhere near as good as a dedicated APS-C size camera sensor. Now to test for video, I've come to my studio setup. This is where I shoot most of my talking heads. I've got a large diffused key light there, I've got an accent light in the background, and you're currently looking at me through the Sony A7 Mark IV with the Tamron 28-75. This is in 4K, full 10-bit color, which this footage is so much fun to film and color grade and edit with. There's just so much information in there. I don't think we're going to see the same amount of information when we switch to the Sony A6000. So let's switch over to the Sony A6000, 3, 2, 1. And now you're looking at me through the Sony A6000. A little bit different. Number one, the A7 Mark IV is filming in f2.8. This is f4, which is the lowest f-stop the lens can work with. This is now the Sony A6000. Now I will say I did have to film this take with the Sony A6000 a couple of times because the screen is so difficult to frame. It doesn't flip out like it does on my Sony A6400 or the A7 Mark IV. It's quite difficult to frame, and also the camera seemed to be focused on the background rather than my face in a lot of the takes. One thing, you are hearing me from the Rode VideoMic Pro Plus, which is still connected to my A7 IV. I'm still using that audio channel. If you want to hear what the Sony A6000 sounds like, it's not going to be good. Here we go. This is now the audio from the Sony A6000. Not terrible, but not the best either. There's a stark difference. The Sony A6000 onboard microphone isn't the best, and since the Sony A6000 doesn't have any option for connecting an external microphone, you do have to record audio externally or separately if you do intend on using this for videography. That's a major drawback of the Sony A6000. But now let's switch back to the Rode VideoMic Pro Plus. Wow. That's much nicer to work with. Another thing, the A6000 battery is not really great at all. It's actually running down. When I started filming this take, it was at 97%, and when I ended this take about 3 minutes later, 3 minutes of footage at 1080p, it's now sitting at 69%. So not great at all. You can literally see the numbers going down. So that was the A6000. Let's switch over to the main camera on the iPhone 13 Pro Max. And here we go, that's the iPhone 13 Pro Max. Much easier to set up, much easier to film with. In theory, I could frame the image much easier because I'd be able to use the camera remote app on my Apple Watch. But that is fairly finicky and it's not working, it's currently not working. So here we have it. 4K from the iPhone 13 Pro Max on the main camera. Now immediately I can tell there's much more sharpening going on here. The image has far less fall off, far less pleasing fall off and bokeh with the background because it's a smaller smartphone size camera sensor. Much brighter as well. So here we go. Let me know which one you prefer. Now, audio test on the iPhone 13 Pro Max. Still, this is the Rode VideoMic Pro Plus. Let's switch over to the 13 Pro Max. And here we go, that's the audio from the iPhone 13 Pro Max. I believe Apple started using a slightly more directional microphone with the 13 Pro Max, with the 13 Pro series. This audio, I do expect it to be far better than the onboard audio of the Sony A6000. That being said, I don't expect it to be anywhere near as good as the audio on the Rode VideoMic Pro Plus. This should now be the video you see me through using the Blackmagic camera app. Much more cinematic, gives you much more control over smaller details, more fine-tuned control. For example, I can individually change ISO values, I can change the white balance, I can change the shutter speed, I can change the FPS, and it also has a really nice extreme stabilization mode which makes the already good iPhone stabilization look like gimbal footage. This might be my favorite output that I can get from the iPhone just because of how much fine-tuned control you have. I guess it just goes to show how versatile even a smartphone sized camera sensor can be. In certain cases, for example this low light shot on the 3x telephoto lens on the iPhone, this looks like a complete oil painting when compared with the A6000, which looks much better. In edge cases like that, you pair the Sony A6000 with a telephoto lens and you can just about forget about any other smartphone camera. Like I said before, it's going to offer you so much more value. If we compare all of the three videos, the A7 Mark IV, the A6000 and the 13 Pro Max, the A7 Mark IV is miles and miles ahead. But we sort of expected that. Interestingly, the A6000 seems to be doing something interesting. There's a lot of noise in the image and the contrast isn't as cinematic as I would have expected. The iPhone image is much sharper, but then again you do get less fall off between the subject and the background, and overall it does look like it was shot with a smartphone. So for about $200 or so, this is an incredible package for photo and video. If you're getting into photography or videography, this is quite possibly one of the best cameras you can start off with. It's mirrorless, it's compact and small, and if down the line you upgrade the lens or spend more time tweaking the settings, you'll get far better value than I'm currently getting. And lenses, that's by far one of the biggest advantages you have with a dedicated camera. I mean, you pair this with a decent telephoto lens and you can just forget about any smartphone camera. Now, I haven't been able to spend as much time tweaking with the settings, changing around the ISO and messing around with picture profiles and tweaking in post-processing as I would have liked. If I had spent more time messing around with all the settings and fixing everything to make it look perfect, I'm sure I could have got slightly better results. Now, one thing to note is if you do intend to use this for videography, this doesn't have a dedicated microphone input, so you will have to record audio separately. This thing allows for so much more control over an image, especially over an iPhone, which are notoriously bad for having bad advanced camera settings. In terms of direct comparison between the iPhone 13 Pro Max and the Sony A6000, the A6000 allows for more fine-tuned control, a more professional and polished final product, but the iPhone wins in terms of portability, ease of use, and shareability. It's easier to share your photos and videos with the iPhone. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide whether you think it's necessary to have a dedicated camera. I personally think it is for those opportunities where you need picture perfect photos and video. If you happen to agree and you want more fine-tuned control over your images, or you're looking to get your feet wet in the world of mirrorless cameras, the Sony A6000 is still a decent stepping stone.